welcome. I'm Chris Gossett. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with one of our most innovative customers and one of our customers that I think has been in the identity space for a long time and is at the forefront of AI. I'm joined today by Alex Dunker, who is an identity architect at NVIDIA. And in fact, maybe without me introducing you, maybe that'd be good for you to tell us a little bit about what you're doing. But
thank you very much, Chris. My name is Alex Dunker, one of the identity architects at NVIDIA. Been there for about 3 years, and a decade before that in the professional services space, working with a lot of our joint customers.
Yeah. Thank you again. I really appreciate you joining us. And the topic of what we're going to talk about today is obviously AI, because it's 2026, and that's what we have to talk about. But as we were thinking about this, you all obviously are such an expert in the identity space, and obviously NVIDIA is very important in the broader AI landscape. So we just thought this was such a great combination of skills to bring forward. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit today. So maybe to start with that as a topic, how do you think about the rise of AI? How is this changing the landscape of identity? And what does that mean? What opportunities does that present for identity leaders and identity teams?
Absolutely. I mean, identity really used to mean human people. Now the majority of our identities in our environments are non-human. We're looking at service counts, API keys, workload identities, OAuth tokens, and now increasingly the AI agents. That ratio at our organization has heavily skewed towards machine identities, and that gap is widening every quarter. But when we look at AI agents and their identities, it's a fundamentally different type. Unlike a service count, which has a predictable set of actions it takes, runs like a cron job, an egg timer. An agent reasons, it's making decisions, it's chaining tool calls together. And that means that the traditional static RBAC policies aren't going to be sufficient. You're going to need to look at attribute-based and context-aware access controls that can actually evaluate what an agent is doing, not just what it's been assigned. And so one of the immediate problems that we hit today is that most agentic systems don't have their own identity at all. When an engineer uses Cursor or Claude Code or Codex, those tools are operating with their own credentials, their SSH keys, their API tokens, their Cloud IAM roles. That agent is inheriting the full blast radius of a human identity. And that's not a theoretical risk. We've seen real incidents where that goes wrong, and we'll get more into that. But I think the opportunity is very interesting for people these days. If you establish proper identity boundaries for agents and give them their own scoped identities rather than piggybacking off of human credentials, you can deploy automation at scale with confidence. That's exactly why our work with SailPoint matters. You need to extend the same governance and least privilege principles you apply to human identities to your agents and machine workloads. That means discovery, ownership, classification, certification, and lifecycle management. Not as separate processes, but with a single governance plane for every single identity type.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it's easy to think about agents as this somewhat mysterious technology. People talk all the time about how do these things work. No one quite understands, and all the different ways they're getting applied. But I think you're exactly right. The fundamentals are still the same, right? It's like, how do I understand what this thing can access, and what systems are there, and how do I control that and put those controls in at scale? It's fascinating to me to think about the kind of thinking aspects of agents and how it's easy to kind of think maybe machine accounts to some extent is the right paradigm, but it's almost really like humans are a better paradigm of how to control that. So maybe my next question then is, if you think about balancing, like this rapid pace of innovation in the space, it feels like every day you wake up and you look at the news, right? And there's some new innovation, some of those coming from NVIDIA, just a different way to do agents or different tools. And, not too long ago, if you would have said MCP server, someone would have been, what is that? Now that feels like that's common knowledge to large swaths of agent builders, and there's new things on the horizon. How do you think about balancing, that rapid pace of innovation with, what historically in security and governance has been a more kind of standards-based, maybe more controlled world?
Yeah, and I think maybe our security teams often get a bad rap at our organizations for slowing down the progress of innovation. And so what we really have to look at doing is embedding the controls into the platform so they're invisible to our developers or our team using these. If governance requires additional workflows, tickets to another team. People are going to route around that. The goal is to be secure by default, not secure by process. And so that's like the design policy behind things like NemoClaw. Jensen launched that at GTC recently. It is layering together enterprise-grade security, whether that's the privacy routing, the network guardrails, policy enforcement through OpenShell, directly into the agent runtime. And he described that the policy engine is what's going to drive all these SaaS companies into the world. And the key insight there is that security is a property of the platform, not necessarily a gate in front of it. And then when we look at the identity governance side, that same principle applies. SailPoint's adaptive identity model replaces periodic batch certifications, for example, with continuous evaluation. Instead of reviewing access once a quarter and rubber stamping, 90% of it, we're looking to turn that to continuously monitoring actual usage and risk signals. And so when something drifts, we're detecting that automatically. And when you start to pair that with just-in-time privilege and privilege discovery, you're not just governing what access exists, you're actively reducing standing privilege. And you get a model where security posture improves the more you deploy. And when you're reducing that standing access to none, you're better off than you were ever before. And so I think the practical takeaway is that if your security architecture requires humans to slow down in order to be safe, it's already broken. You have to automate the controls.
Yeah, just a quick tangent off of that, and you hit on something that I really think is interesting. It's easy to think about agents as this kind of new realm to govern and all the challenges that come with that. But back to maybe the previous point of the kind of fundamentals are the same. I'm curious, do you think that kind of security as part of the platform bleeds into the human identity space as time goes on, right? It's almost like we're going to get great at agents, which is going to make us even better at humans.
A lot of these principles across identity types have the same core high-level principles that we have to be accomplishing for. And so having that good foundation and having that single governance plane is just so incredibly important. And I think probably why you have to have that good foundation then to scale up. Yes, there are going to be unique challenges with how we're governing and how we're treating these things, right? I think a lot of people, we can talk more about cryptographic identity eventually, but Spiffy and Spire were things that we thought were going to be big innovations, and the agentic space came up. It's oh, we have to quickly pivot some of these things for human and workload machines because some of the primitives don't make sense with attaching identity to the machine. Rather, now we have to get the agent and how it changes and moves differently there too. So
yeah.
I think the fundamentals are still baseline very similar, but we have to change how we scale and become innovative around that.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the commonality, but maybe thinking now about agents at the other side of that, what do you think are some of the most critical security challenges that specifically autonomous agents provide? What should you be thinking about? How do you kind of get in front of those unique agent problems that from an identity perspective?
Absolutely. I still think the biggest one, we mentioned this already, is the most obvious that's happening right now. Agents are operating under human identities with zero separation. Today, when a developer is firing up their coding tools, that agent is acting with the developer's credentials. It has their Git access, it has their AWS IAM role, their API keys. It has access to the database connection strings. The agent doesn't have its own identity, and as far as as far as we think about it, it is you in every downstream system. And we've seen what happens when that goes wrong. I mean, I think a week or two ago, we saw that a cursor agent with Claude Code deleted PocketOS's entire production database and all the backups in a single API call, under 9 seconds.
Yeah.
When we think about that, the agent found a credential in a file that it wasn't even supposed to be looking in, an API token, and it decided it was going to fix its own issues by deleting the entire production volume. No confirmation prompt, no human in the loop. The token was really scoped for the developer, right? A senior engineer who might need break glass access or the ability to go do that, but it's far more privileged than any agent should ever have. And that's not an isolated incident. We're seeing across the industry, production databases, code being changed. These things continue to happen. I think last year, when we looked at code freezes going into effect at certain companies,
yeah.
and the autonomous agents were making these changes on their own. These aren't edge cases at all. The Center for Long-Term Resilience actually identified nearly 700 cases in a 6 or 7 month span where an AI agent was taking covert, deceptive, or unrequested actions. And then you get to the operational confusion problem. When an agent makes a commit, opens a pull request, or modifies a cloud infrastructure using your credentials, the audit trail says you did it. Did you make that merge request? Did you spin up that EC2 instance? I think the scary part is, when you or I are, up at 2 a.m. digging into incident logs, and you're trying to understand whether it was a human-initiated action or agent-initiated action. If both show up as the same IAM principle, you've lost that signal entirely. And we're still fighting with that tension like we talked about in the previous problem. We want to enable our developers with auto-run agents and let them really hit those big productivity gains. But just like rubber stamping certifications is an issue and a governance problem, constantly having your developers click approve for agent actions defeats the purpose of having that agent in the first place. So really when your agent doesn't have its own identity and is inheriting your full set of permissions, that auto run just becomes dramatically riskier. You're giving an autonomous system a blank check drawn on your own credentials. And then I think one of the interesting things that people aren't even starting to think about too is it goes beyond that into the supply chain aspects of these agents. When you look at what the agent has access to and can do with skills, MCP tools, plugins, and these are executable instructions that shape an agent's behavior. And right now, there's no standard verification for any of that. We've seen the industry have a significant percentage of community-published agent skills contain malware. These are attackers finding their way into your systems from pulling skills that we thought would be helpful. And the same way that historically we've signed container images and verified software dependencies, we need to start to think about that in the supply chain for our agents. So agent identity governance not only has to know about the access that the agent has, but it starts to need to think about what signed skills and tools actually shaped the actions that the agent did. And that's where we can start to close that audit loop. And that's really, once again, when we start to give the agent its own identity, that's really where we are allowed to start to build all those components around it. So a scoped, governed, auditable identity with its own credentials and its own entitlements, with its own life cycle, lets us have that separate from the human who launched it. And that gets us through those least privilege problems, the scoping problems, you get the clean audit trail. I certainly feel bad for some of our folks in more governed areas where they have to have more regulations around this. But if you think about what happens if something goes wrong, if today in this world you are using your own credentials, if I see your agent going awry and I have to revoke its access, that's your access that got revoked. That means you can't work anymore. So when we actually start building that separate agent identity and can control its access there and revoke that, you're still productive. I'm not taking you out from a whole day's work. And that's really where I think SailPoint's agent identity security really matters and really starts to drive for us with the combination of it and machine identity security. We're registering these agents as first-class identities. We're assigning them owner. We're scoping that access. We can run certification campaigns that cover both the agent in a new type of way and the traditional campaigns against humans who invoke it. And so all of that reporting and all that even starts to understand that privilege problem. And we can understand where a human even might get elevated access through invoking an agent that might have a different access model. We'll start to think about, hey, is it appropriate for an agent to have access that a human doesn't? And what does that mean when the human invokes that agent that might have elevated access? Are there going to be organizations that say the agent cannot have any more access than the human? I don't know. We'll see. I think that's an interesting thing for a lot of organizations to figure out. But when you look at those incidents that we talked about before, if any of those organizations had that blast radius, probably looks a lot different than what they had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you think about it, what traditionally we've done at a higher level in the identity space is translated all of the nuances of access and sometimes like the nuances of permissions and entitlements and presented that up to a business user and said, hey, is this appropriate or not? You just did such a great job of illustrating the complexities of an agent. I think that's our challenge is how do we take all of that in a way that the business users can understand and can they say, okay, this is the right access for the agent or it's not, right? We need to dial this in and make it happen. I also love, you gave an example that I've been using a lot lately, which is that Pocket OS example. It's such a great use case, or probably for them unfortunate, but an interesting case study in that removing some or creating some friction of like, hey, this is an overscoped human. Probably if you want to go make a change to a production database, you should probably have to go elevate your permissions. That probably shouldn't be a standing permission, and you should justify that and make sure that's appropriate or not. And then same thing for the agent. So it illustrates those two sides of like agents acting on their own and finding weak points and exploiting those. I think that's going to be the theme and the identity for the next decade probably, and then that call to action of like, hey, let's try to remove standing privileges, not just from agents, but from humans as well.
Exactly. I think SailPoint has a lot of interesting challenges that they're going to have to tackle in the space. I think the lucky part and the great part for you guys is being an innovator and being on the forefront of this space. You guys have been working on a lot of these problems that apply to humans traditionally to make it more secure, but in the same way to agents. And so I think we'll see a lot of continued innovation in that way.
And I think the urgency to get that done, given the agentic scale and, the blast radius. Yeah. So maybe changing tacks a little bit, instead of talking about the risks and all of the, maybe the downsides of agents or the challenges that are there, what about on the other side? How have you seen AI and ML being able to use kind of proactively to better detect risk or to maybe mitigate identity risk before they even happen?
Absolutely. Like you said, AI is both the attack surface and the defense. The same capability that makes agents so powerful, that pattern recognition, anomaly detection, reasoning over large data sets, it can be turned inward to improve your identity security and improve our organization's identity security. Scale is largely the core of that problem, I think, as we continue to talk about. At NVIDIA, our identity graph spans millions of entitlements across thousands of applications, and no human reviewer could ever meaningfully assess that. When we look at AI, we have to look at AI-powered analytics and how we can identify outlier access patterns. An engineer, like you mentioned, in one business unit who has somehow admin access in a finance application and can flag that for review or even auto-remediate that based on policy. And this is something that we're seeing in practice and using things like observability and insights and feeding that all into our identity graph so we can understand that real-time privilege visibility using things like privilege risk scoring and shifting from reactive identity, that quarterly type attestation, to proactive with that anomalous entitlements that we're surfacing within minutes or hours. I think data access governance is another interesting half of the picture. It's not going to be enough to know who has access to which applications, but you need to know who can write, read, and exfiltrate all that unstructured data that's in your organization. And that unstructured data, given the size and scale, is we're going to have to use AI to start to understand some of that. We're looking at things like data access security and how that fits in there, and it fits with the identity graph to visualize all that, the data access paths and map sensitive data exposure across that environment. One of the interesting things I'm thinking about these days, you look at things like agent memory. That's one of the newest surfaces we'll see that we need to defend. Something that I don't think most organizations are even starting to think to talk about, right? They're just thinking about how do we get agents with memory. But when agents actually start storing knowledge from conversations shared across teams, through whether it's gated namespaces or coordinated through shared state, that's sensitive, unstructured data being created and accessed by non-human identities. Those agents are working on your crown jewels, right? Your algorithms in the finance world or your software, right? They understand that. And the same way that you have to apply data access governance to a SharePoint or a database and understand who can read it, who can write it, under what delegation, what retention policies you have to think about that lens to agent-generated knowledge stores. And if you start thinking about that and closing that gap, you're way ahead of everybody else. But to do that, we're going to have to continue to leverage AI, right? And that's going to be the really interesting piece. And then I think about some of the next areas. We've seen a lot of convergence in our identity teams with other security teams across the organization. So working much more closely with our SOC. So when we're starting to correlate identity signals, unusual access patterns, privilege escalation, using the shared signals framework to find things like credential anomalies, that threat intelligence gap changes from, my team knows who has what access. But now we're working with other teams to know, we know who is suspiciously acting with that access. And so that identity context really makes the security alerts richer. And so when you can attribute actions to a specific agent identity and track what skill-shaped behavior, and your forensics know about data access, and using all of these signals and AI to help understand and triage that, we're just getting dramatically sharper with what we can do, right? So the practical application, I'd say, is using AI to reduce all the noise that we have across the organization. Whether the example is taking human certifications and helping reduce the rubber stamping by letting the AI do initial passes and understanding what access may or may not be appropriate, to continuously monitoring the huge amount of signals that we have coming into our systems. Just leveraging that across the board and integrating as much data as we can across our teams to provide a better security stance.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that AI is such a force multiplier. It seems like it's great at the things identity teams need, right? Which is kind of finding needles in haystacks and understanding the risk around that. It's exciting to think about just the next few chapters of how that plays out. So maybe actually that's a great transition to this next question. When you think about identity security in the future, how do you think about the identity security evolving to meet the governance challenges that AI agents present today, and then as they continue to get deployed more and more widely?
Yeah, and the governance space is interesting because that periodic certification model was designed for a static workforce, right? And so in an agentic economy, those identities become ephemeral, or those permissions assigned are very short-lived, and they're shifting constantly. So an agent can chain actions across multiple systems, execution, and so governance has to operate at the same speed. I see several shifts happening because of that. We kind of talked about that continuous adaptive governance model, replacing those batch reviews with real-time evaluation of access against both risk signals and pairing it with automated remediation. I think interesting, we have to have agent-aware access models that understand the difference between a human, service count, and autonomous agent, and then apply the appropriate controls to each. And really, this is just all about, I think, in defense in depth. So security controls at an agent runtime layer and an identity governance layer operating independently. I think we've seen Mark McLean and Matt Mills get up at the Navigate stage, and they always tell us that the new security perimeter is identity. Yeah. That's not changing, right? It's still all converging to identity. We look at sandbox technology for these agents, and it's maturing fast, right? It's getting a lot better. It's isolating agents from the host. But that trust boundary can still change and is still moving, right? Current sandbox designs prevent agents from trying to break out, but they don't prevent a compromised host from having its credentials that the agent has been given the ability to be scraped and used. We look at how do we bind identity to both the sandbox instance and that runtime context, not just the human who started that session. And that's where we really start to get into those mechanisms like cryptographic attestation, the SPIFFE, the SPIRE, those verifiable workload identities, whether using the hardware, the TPMs, confidential computing. We have to prove which agent instance on which host took what action. And so I think the direction becomes clear for us, right? An agent identity stops being a token in a config file and starts becoming the cryptographically attested runtime property. Yeah. Ultimately, the security perimeter and the identity boundary are the same thing. And we've been talking about that for years with human identities now. I think agent intent becomes a really interesting access control signal. Today, just-in-time and access decisions are made on static attributes, right? Who are you? What role do you have? What resource are you asking for? With agents, you have something new to work with, right? An agent can declare what it's trying to do before it actually does that, right? The plan, the tool calls it's going to make, the data it wants to touch. That declared intent can flow into an access decision, right? So that just-in-time elevation that's scoped to the specific task rather than the agent's general role or the human's general role that invoked it. So if we can build policy engines that approve a read but block a write because the stated intent was different and didn't include that modification, it just becomes so incredibly powerful for us. And we can understand what the agent said it would do versus what it did, and even think about revoking that access mid-execution if it's diverging, right? Mm-hmm. So being intent aware about access is what's going to let us safely run those agents in those full auto runs, in those hosts, and the governance plane has to understand that context and be able to make real-time decisions instead of a blanket providing access to an agent. And that's why we're going to need AI to be part of that in our defense against AI as well.
Yeah.
And so thankfully, your team has been building towards that for a while, whether that's the real-time governance, non-human components, dynamic privilege, and that integrated threat management. That's all what we're going to need. And so from my perspective, the architecture that makes the most sense is layered, right? So you have the agent platform that handles the sandboxing and the policy enforcement, and the identity platform that handles governance, lifecycle, and compliance. They're complementary, and you need both.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And to me, that's the really exciting thing about where we are in the identity space is, for a long time, we've been asking, like, what do people have access to, or do identities have access to? And, and is that appropriate, which is still a fundamental question. But I think where you were going is it's more of the, like, why do they have this access? What task are they trying to accomplish? And can we get insight into that and control that?
Can we see if it's diverging?
That's right, yeah. And I think that's an exciting problem to solve with agents. It's also exciting to think about, well, how do you apply that now to the combination of human and agent as well? Because if you do that, now your security controls go up, probably by an order of magnitude, right? Of just being able to really get into, is this, whatever's happening, is this an anomaly and I should ask some more questions and stop it? Or no, this is normal behavior, we should keep moving on.
Absolutely.
It's exciting to think about where that goes. All right, so maybe to wrap up, you can get your crystal ball out for us and kind of look broader, right? If you're thinking about other people coming into this space, other organizations that are just starting on their agent journey, or other identity leaders that are starting to realize like, ooh, wait, I've got to step up. This is a problem I have to solve. What advice do you have for kind of people starting that journey as they start to prepare for this new agentic world?
Absolutely. I think if we look out to people out there, if you don't have your identity foundation correct first, if you don't have that solid governance over existing human and non-human machine identities, if you can't tell me who has access to what today, adding agent identities is going to compound that problem. Try to consolidate onto a unified platform that handles every identity type. That's what I try to do with SailPoint Identity Security Cloud today, right? Human, non-employee, machine, agent identities, all in one place. And stop letting human identities be borrowed by agents. I think that's one of the lower hanging fruits and the highest impact change. Every agent workflow, whether it's a cursor session, a codex run, or an internal automation, should have its own scoped identity with least privilege access. And where you can, try to broker access outside that sandbox. Use short-lived device-bound credentials, and do your best to not give agents API keys and plain text files. I think the incidents that we talked about before really teach us anything that's that an overly scoped token in the hands of an autonomous agent might be no different than a compromised credential. And then I think the next thing is, as you're starting your agent identity journey, as you're starting your agent journey, treat agent identity as a day one concern, not as a phase two concern. Yeah. Every agent deployment should have a defined owner, scoped access, a certification lifecycle from the start. And don't just govern the agent's identity, govern its toolbox. If you can't verify what skills an agent loaded, you can't fully audit what it did. And tools that SailPoint's building is really what's going to start to let us bring agents into governance as they're deployed. Not 6 months later when you're finding when your audit finding forces it. I think I'd say invest into just-in-time and least privilege now, right? Standing privilege is the single biggest risk multiplier in both a human and agentic environment. An over-permissioned agent gets compromised or just makes a bad decision, it's an attacker's dream. So reduce that blast radius before you scale. And then I think, we didn't really get to talk about it much today, but I think one of the most interesting things we can think about is planning for multi-agent delegation before you're in the middle of it. Most of what we talked about today is assuming a single agent acting on behalf of a human, but that's the easy case, right? It's not where things are heading though. The harder problem, and the one most enterprises are about to walk into, is an agent to agent. Agent A, maybe an HR agent needs to get something done, invokes an IT agent, agent B, which then calls agent C, which then touches a production system. Whose identity does C act under? Whose entitlements apply at each hop? How do you prevent privilege accumulating across that chain? And so we have emerging standards like A2A or agent-to-agent protocols and delegation tokens with OAuth successor work, and they're starting to formalize, but most organizations do not have a model for it today. Start to think about, are you going to allow delegated agents calls to run from the originating human, the calling agent, a fresh scoped identity pure hop, and make sure your governance platform can certify that full chain and not just the endpoints. So something to really think about. And then lastly, really for my friends in the regulatory areas, get ahead of the accountability question before regulators ask it for you. We have the EU AI Act, NIST AI Risk Management Framework, and emerging SEC and FTC guidance. They're all converging on the same thing. When an autonomous agent asks or takes a consequential action, who's accountable? Is it you? Can you answer that question? And you can't do that without per agent identity. If every agent action shows up under the same human IAM principle, your only honest answer to a regulator is, we don't know. Identity is the substrate for that accountability. And you want to be building it now, not retrofitting it under the guise of an onlook of federal agents.
Yeah, no doubt.
And I guess I'll say to echo Jensen, every company needs an agentic system strategy. The question isn't whether agents will be a part of your enterprise. It's when and whether they'll be governed when they arrive. And identity security is what makes the agentic economy work at scale.
Well, That's a lot to think about. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I think I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did as well. Really appreciate all of your wisdom, and thanks for taking some time with us today to share some of that.
And thanks for having me. I wish everyone the best of luck with this. It's very rapidly and fast-paced changing times, and hopefully we find that exciting, maybe a little bit stressful.
Yeah, thanks again.